September 1938. Czechoslovakia stands at the edge of catastrophe. Adolf Hitler, the German Reich Chancellor, issues an ultimatum: cede the Sudetenland, a border region inhabited by ethnic Germans, or face war. On September 29th and 30th, the leaders of Great Britain, France, Italy and Germany gather in Munich. Without inviting the Czechoslovaks themselves, they agree to Hitler's demands in exchange for his hollow promise of peace. The betrayal is complete. Less than 6 months later, on March 15, 1939, Nazi Germany tears up the Munich Agreement and invades Czechoslovakia. Adolf Hitler himself arrives in Prague. From the ancient halls of Prague Castle, he proclaims the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. More than 118,000 Jews now fall under Nazi rule. One of them is a 10-year-old girl named Dita Polach. This is her story, a story of unimaginable suffering, extraordinary courage, and a revenge that took the form of survival itself. Edith Polach, known to everyone as Dita, was born on March 12, 1929 in Prague. She was the only child of Elizabeth and Hans Polach, a family that spoke both German and Czech and lived comfortably in a rented apartment with a maid. Her mother Elizabeth was a homemaker. Her father Hans worked as a lawyer for the state pension office, traveling throughout Czechoslovakia to represent workers' interests in court. Dita's grandfather, Johann Polach, was a social democratic senator in the Czechoslovak parliament. For young Dita, life was simple and joyful: school, friends, the park, childhood as it should be. But on January 30, 1933, when Adolf Hitler became German Reich Chancellor, everything began to change. Dita was only 3 years old. She didn't understand why her parents' friends, Jews fleeing Germany, arrived in Prague with horrifying stories. She didn't know why her parents spoke in worried whispers about Nazism, persecution, and the Nuremberg laws. She didn't even know she was Jewish. The Polach family was not religious, but she could see the fear in her parents' eyes. When the Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia in March 1939, that fear became reality. New laws targeted Jews immediately. Bank accounts were frozen, businesses and property were confiscated, $500 million worth of Jewish wealth seized. 2 German officers arrived at the Polach apartment and ordered the family out. Dita's father was dismissed from his position like all Jewish teachers, doctors and civil servants. Dita's childhood ended abruptly. Jews were banned from streets, parks, forests and public spaces. After September 1st, 1939, the day World War II began, Jews were forbidden to be outdoors after 8 p.m. By August 1940, Jewish children were no longer allowed to attend school. The Polachs were forced into a single room of a 2-room apartment, sharing the space with another family. By November 1940, the restrictions multiplied. Jews could not leave their communities without permission. They were barred from libraries, theaters, cinemas, restaurants, and swimming pools. Their radios were confiscated. They were forced to give up their pets. On public transports, they had to stand in the last carriage. Food rations were limited to specific shopping hours. In this enforced isolation, there was one place of light: Hajibor, a playground with tennis and volleyball courts where Jewish children could still meet and play. It was organized by Friedrich Hirsch, a German Jewish athlete and Zionist youth leader who refused to let the children's spirits be crushed. Because Jews were no longer allowed to use public transport, Dita walked an hour each way to reach Hagibor. It was worth it. For a few hours, she could still be a child. In October 1941, the systematic deportation of Jews from the Protectorate began. 5,000 were sent to the WWII ghetto in occupied Poland. Among them was Dita's beloved uncle, Ludwig. Shortly after, the family received a card informing them of his death. Of those 5,000 Jews, only 277 survived. But Uncle Ludwig's widow, Aunt Marja, who was not Jewish, defied Nazi law and continued to help Dita and her parents with food and basic necessities. In November 1941, Reinhard Heydrich, one of the architects of the Holocaust, established the Theresienstadt Ghetto in a fortress town within the Protectorate. The first transport of Czech Jews arrived that same month. Dita's father worked in a Jewish community department. Because of his position, their family's deportation was delayed by several months. But in July 1942, Dita's grandparents were deported to Theresienstadt. In the November 1942, Dita and her parents followed. They were allowed to bring only 50 kilograms of luggage, some clothing, a blanket, a pillow, a bowl, and non-perishable food. Everything else left in their apartment was confiscated by the Germans. When they arrived at the ghetto, it was so overcrowded they had to sleep on the floor. Grandmother Polach found them and brought devastating news. Grandfather Johann had died 3 weeks earlier. Conditions in Theresienstadt were brutal. Insufficient water and electricity. Overcrowding. Bedbugs, fleas, lice. No privacy. The food distributed by a central kitchen was barely enough to sustain life. A portion of soup made mostly from lentil powder, a few potatoes or a dumpling, a small loaf of bread cut into 6 portions, a spoonful of margarine or jam. Never fruit. Never vegetables. People were starving. About 200 prisoners died each day. Men and women lived in separate barracks, sleeping in 3-tiered wooden bunks. Children's homes had only a table, a bench, and beds. Prisoners spent their waking hours working, waiting in food lines, or lying on their bunks trying to conserve energy. Everyone aged 14 to 60 had to work, most in German war production or vegetable gardens. The vegetables they grew were not for them but for Nazi personnel. Dita worked in the gardens. Those who couldn't work, mostly the elderly, received even less food. 92% of deaths were among people over 60. Nearly all elderly inmates who weren't deported to extermination camps died in Theresienstadt. But within this hell, there were small acts of resistance. Theresienstadt was administered by a Jewish council that included Freddie Hirsch. He headed the Children and Youth Department and worked tirelessly to ease conditions for the children, to prevent that demoralization. He secured better accommodations, the so-called homes. Though schooling was forbidden, former professors, scientists, and teachers secretly educated the children. It was a fragile oasis in a landscape of death. The first transport from Theresienstadt to the extermination camps in the east left on January 9, 1942. From October 26, 1942 onward, all transports had only one destination, Auschwitz-Birkenau. In the first transport, 1,166 people were deported. Upon arrival, 247, mostly men, were registered as prisoners. The remaining 1,619 were murdered in the gas chambers immediately. To maintain the illusion that deportations were resettlements, Jews from the German Reich were transported in passenger trains. But Jews in occupied Eastern Europe suffered far worse. Crammed into sealed cattle cars with no food or water, enduring extreme heat in summer and freezing temperatures in winter. Many died before reaching their destination. In December 1943, the Polachs were informed they had been selected for deportation to a labor camp in the east. The transport was so overcrowded that men, women, children, and the elderly could not sit. They had to stand for almost 2 days. There were no sanitary facilities except a single bucket, which overflowed within hours. The stench of urine and excrement deepened the sense of humiliation and suffering. Many died due to lack of food, water, and ventilation. Armed police escorted the transport with orders to shoot anyone attempting to escape. When the train finally stopped and the doors opened, Dita and her parents arrived in Auschwitz. They did not know that the worst still lay ahead. Between October 1942 and October 1944, the Germans sent almost 47,000 Jews from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz in 27 transport trains. While life in Theresienstadt still carried some minimal value, this was no longer the case in Auschwitz. When Dita's transport arrived, it was night. The exhausted arrivals were blinded by harsh lights. SS men with attack dogs lined the platform. Prisoners in striped uniforms beat them with sticks, shouting orders. They were told to leave their luggage and form 2 columns, men and boys in one, women and girls in the other. Women and girls were taken into a wooden shed where they spent the night sitting on the cold, hard floor. In the morning, Dita, her mother, and the other women had to undress, take a freezing cold shower, and then, wet and shivering, run through the snow to another barrack. There they received old civilian clothes and worn-out shoes. And they did not receive striped uniforms like other Auschwitz prisoners. Dita, now 14 years old, had kept her shoes on during the shower. She managed to save them. Then came the tattoos. Every prisoner was marked on the left forearm with a number. From that moment on, Dita was no longer called by her name. She was number 73,305. The entire transport was placed in the Theresienstadt family camp, officially designated as Section BIIB of the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex. It had been established on September 8, 1943, specifically for Jews from the Theresienstadt Ghetto. Between 1943 and 1944, about 18,000 deported Jews were housed there. After the so-called Gypsy family camp, this was the second camp where men, women, and children were housed together, though they slept separately. The camp was created by the Nazis for propaganda purposes to show the Red Cross and the world that conditions weren't as bad as reported. Otherwise, conditions were identical to other camps: hunger, beatings, hard labor, cold, and complete lack of basic items like towels, combs, or toilet paper. The Theresienstadt family camp consisted of wooden barracks, originally horse stables, windowless except for narrow openings under the roof. Each barrack held 300 prisoners. One contained a washroom with a row of faucets from which cold brownish water dripped. Another served as the latrine, long concrete blocks with holes placed above a pit, divided into male and female sections only by a strip of burlap, something many prisoners found deeply humiliating. When Dita and her parents met those who had been deported from Theresienstadt 3 months earlier, they were shocked. These people had changed completely. Their skin was pale and grey. Nobody smiled. They spoke of strange things: gas chambers, chimneys where they would all end up. Their expressions were disturbing, their eyes large and empty. When they pointed to the chimneys from which flames shot up into the night, when they pointed to the grey ash that filled the air like snow, the newcomers didn't understand. Eventually, Dita realized the truth. The ash and the smell came from the crematoria where the bodies of those murdered in the gas chambers were burned. Prisoners had to gather for roll call in the morning and afternoon to be counted. If the numbers didn't match, roll call was extended and could last for hours, especially torturous in rain, snow, or freezing temperatures. The only food they received was a bowl of soup at midday, and in the evening a piece of bread with a spoonful of margarine or jam. Prisoners were so hungry that they could think of nothing but food. It consumed every waking thought. One day in February 1944, Dita noticed that her father had not come to roll call. After dark, she managed to sneak into the men's barrack. He lay on his bunk with his eyes closed. When she saw that he had not eaten his soup, she knew he was close to death. He died that same night. Dita's mother knew nothing of this. She was in the isolation barrack with an infectious disease, and Dita was not allowed to visit. Dita told her the sad news through a crack in the wooden wall. Later, both were grateful he died on his bunk and not in the gas chambers. One of the privileges of the Theresienstadt family camp was the creation of the children's block located in Barrack 31. Children could stay there during the day until afternoon roll call. The block was empty except for small stools on which the children sat in circles by age group, each group supervised by an adult. They played guessing games, sang, all were secretly taught lessons. All of this was done orally. There were no toys, no paper, no pencils. The only tools were a dozen books smuggled in by prisoners who sorted the luggage of new arrivals. Dita was responsible for those books. She was the camp librarian. She hid the books during inspections, memorized their locations, distributed them carefully, and collected them again, all while knowing that if she was caught, she would be killed. The head of the children's block was Freddie Hirsch, whom Dita knew from Prague and Theresienstadt. Hirsch convinced the camp commander to allow the children's block by arguing it would keep the children occupied while their parents performed forced labor. He also managed to obtain additional food for the children, ensured the block was heated, and made sure roll call for children took place indoors. He was extremely strict about hygiene, insisting the children wash daily, even in the freezing winter of 1943-44, and conducted regular lice checks. Thanks to his efforts, the children's mortality rate was almost zero, while overall mortality in the family camp reached about 25% within the first 6 months. In February 1944, the resistance movement in Auschwitz realized the significance of a notation written next to each prisoner's name in the camp records, SB6. It stood for Sonderbehandlung, special treatment, a Nazi euphemism for murder in the gas chamber. The 6 referred to the time frame, execution after 6 months. Some prisoners planned an uprising. They intended to burn the barracks, break through the gate, and run for their lives. Freddie Hirsch was chosen as one of the leaders, but he died that very day under unclear circumstances. One theory holds that about an hour before the uprising, he asked for a sedative for his nerves. The imprisoned doctors had only sleeping pills and deliberately gave him an overdose to prevent him from leading the revolt. Dr. Mengele had promised to call certain prisoners back because he needed them in the infirmary. A failed uprising, the doctors feared, would cost them their lives as well. Freddie fell into a deep sleep and was unable to blow his whistle to start the revolt. Later that day, Freddie was carried on a stretcher, along with 3,800 other men, women and children from the September transport, onto trucks and taken to the gas chambers. All of them were murdered. The doctors were summoned back to the family camp beforehand, just as Mengele had promised. After the liquidation of the September transport, activities in the children's block continued, with a new block leader, but Dita, who had arrived in Auschwitz in December 1943, knew that her life would end 6 months later, in June 1944. Her 6 months were almost up. In May 1944, new orders arrived from Germany. Prisoners were to be selected for labor in the German armaments industry. The doctor conducting the selection was known in Auschwitz as the Angel of Death. His name was Josef Mengele. Men aged 16 to 45 and women aged 16 to 40 were ordered to come forward. They had to undress, stand at attention, and say 3 things: their tattoo number, their age, and their profession. Not yet 15, Dita knew she would be murdered in the gas chamber if she was not chosen for work. She made a decision that would save her life. She pretended to be 16 and declared her profession to be painter. Mengele looked at her. House painter or portrait painter? Portrait painter, Dita answered. Can you paint my portrait? Yes. With a wave of his hand, Mengele sent her to the group selected for hard labor. But when Dita looked around, she realized her mother had been placed in another group, the group marked for death. Somehow Dita managed to slip back into line and hide among other thin women. When her mother came forward for selection, this time Mengele sent her to the same group as Dita. Both had been chosen to live, at least for now. The Theresienstadt family camp was dissolved in July 1944. The remaining 7,000 men, women, children and infants were murdered in the gas chambers. About 2,000 women and 1,000 men who survived the selection were transported by train to other camps in Nazi Germany, to Stutthof, to the subcamps of NEUENGAMME near Hamburg. Dita and her mother were among them. By the end of the war, the mortality rate in NEUENGAMME and its subcamps, which had been steadily rising, reached catastrophic levels. In the winter of 1944-45, 1,700 prisoners died each month. In February 1945 alone, almost 2,500 died. Dita and the other prisoners were subjected to regular air raids, 2 to 3 every night, forcing them into cellars infested with rats. Prisoners had to rise at 5 a.m., gather for roll call, and march to their assigned workplaces to perform heavy labor outside. This included collecting bricks from bombed-out buildings and stacking them for reuse, digging trenches, clearing snow from the streets. Sometimes German civilians, who themselves suffered under the bombings, gave the starving prisoners some food. Small acts of humanity in an ocean of cruelty. In March 1945, the SS evacuated the NEUENGAMME subcamps. The prisoners, including Dita and her mother, were sent to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. What they found there was hell itself. The sanitary conditions in Bergen-Belsen were catastrophic. There was no water for washing and barely enough to drink. Between January and March 5th, as prisoners from other camps were driven on death marches to Bergen-Belsen, about 1/3 of the prisoners already in the camp died. Those who arrived were so weak that almost 80% had to be transported from the train station by truck because they could not walk. During the death marches, prisoners received almost no food. Upon arrival at Bergen-Belsen, there was none either. The camp was so overcrowded that prisoners had to sleep sitting on the ground. During the freezing winter months, tens of thousands had to share only 200 blankets. On average, 250 to 300 prisoners died each day. They starved, they thirsted, or they succumbed to a typhus epidemic that swept through the camp. Bodies lay everywhere, unburied, rotting in the spring sun. On April 15, 1945, the British 11th Armoured Division liberated Bergen-Belsen. What they found was beyond comprehension. Almost 13,000 unburied corpses, nearly 60,000 sick and starving prisoners. Even in the months after liberation, thousands more died of diseases like typhus and tuberculosis. The British soldiers, hardened by years of war, wept at what they saw. The prisoners finally received food and clothing. Because of the typhus epidemic and the infestation of lice, the entire camp was burned down. Former camp guards, both men and women, were forced to help bury the bodies in mass graves. Among the liberated prisoners were Dita and her mother Elizabeth. Since Dita spoke Czech, German and English, she volunteered as an interpreter for the British forces. A few days later, however, she came down with typhus. While Dita recovered, her mother Elizabeth, who spoke Czech, German, English and French, volunteered as a secretary for the British camp commandant. In June 1945, liberated prisoners who had recovered from typhus and were no longer contagious were invited to recuperate in Sweden. Dita and her mother both wanted to go, but Elizabeth needed proof that she was not contagious. She therefore pretended to be ill and went to the temporary hospital, assuming she would spend only 2 or 3 days there before receiving the necessary document. When Dita visited her on the second day, Elizabeth complained of feeling unwell. Dita had no doubt she would soon recover. After having survived so much suffering, how could she not? But when Dita went to visit her mother on the third day, she found the bed empty. The patient in the next bed whispered, "Your mother has died." After everything they had endured, after Theresienstadt, after Auschwitz, after the death marches, after Bergen-Belsen, after liberation. Elizabeth Polach died just weeks after being freed. She had survived the Nazis. She did not survive the aftermath. The next morning, Dita's close friend accompanied her on a bus from Bergen-Belsen to Prague. 2 days later, she was reunited with her Aunt Marja, the widow of her deceased uncle Ludwig, the woman who had risked her life to help them during the occupation. A few weeks after returning, Dita met Otto Kraus, one of the teachers from the children's block in Auschwitz. He too had lost his family in the Holocaust. Dita had known Otto's mother because they had been imprisoned together in NEUENGAMME and Bergen-Belsen. Otto's brother Harry had died on a death march in January 1945. Like Dita's mother, Otto's mother died shortly after liberation, her body finally giving out after years of suffering. In September 1945, Dita went to Telch for a year to attend grammar school. She and Otto wrote to each other almost daily. After a year, she returned to Prague. In 1947, Dita and Otto married. Otto studied at Prague University and later became the director of the factory that had belonged to his family before the German occupation. But in February 1948, when the communists took power in Czechoslovakia, Otto lost the factory again. History, it seemed, had a cruel sense of repetition. In May 1949, Dita and Otto moved to Israel. They both worked as teachers. Otto was also an author. His books were translated into several languages. Dita herself wrote 2 autobiographical books, A Delayed Life, Childhood in the Concentration Camp, and Life with Otto. They had 3 children and lived a happy life together until Otto died in 2000. Today, at age 95, Dita Kraus lives in Israel, surrounded by her family, including 4 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. The Nazis intended to murder all Jews. They did not succeed. Dita's revenge lies not only in surviving and continuing to give lectures about the suffering she endured during the Holocaust, but also in her legacy, her courage living on through her children, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren. In 2012, Spanish journalist Antonio G. Iturbe told her story in the Librarian of Auschwitz, a book translated into 30 languages and printed in over 1 million copies. To this day, Dita's story, like that of many others, serves as an example of the courage required to resist inhumane and cruel forces in the world. I am now one of the last who can still talk about the Holocaust from personal experience. People often ask me, especially young people, what do you want from us? What should we do so that something like this never happens again? My answer is, work against hatred. Children do not have hatred. They are not born with it. It is learned. When we visit a kindergarten, we see that young children accept their friends whether they look different or have a different skin color without hesitation. The differences come from adults who tell them, "You must not play with that child because he is different." Most people in the world want the same things: happiness, love for their families, a good life. The differences between us are small: skin color, eye color, or the way we pray to God. But even then, we pray to the same God, even if we call him by different names. What I ask of the audience is this: work against hatred. Teach children tolerance and respect. Do not demand anything from others that you would not demand of yourself. Thank you very much. The Nazis tried to erase her. They tattooed a number on her arm to replace her name. But Dita Kraus refused to be erased. She became the librarian of Auschwitz, protecting books, protecting hope, protecting the future, and in the end, she won.